It's not difficult to find Great Britain on the world map. It's not the biggest island compared to Russia, the United States, or China. Besides, it's surrounded by the boundless sea on almost all sides. But just 6 centuries ago, it was hard even to imagine that the majority of the world would speak the language of this isolated country. Throughout its history, Britain has repeatedly proved its power and influence. It was the British rulers who determined the fate of a huge part of the planet, turning entire countries into their colonies. The British gave the world Shakespeare, Sherlock Holmes, and Harry Potter. The songs of Queen and Beatles have long been recognized as world classics, and Charles Darwin, Isaac Newton, and the Industrial Revolution completely changed the course of history, creating the modern world as we know it. 5 years ago, Great Britain impressed the world again when it declared its withdrawal from the European Union. This is the first country that rejected European policy and chose its own path. Brexit was so loud that literally everyone was talking about it. With this action, Great Britain went all in and shocked a lot of people. But you know what? I'm personally not surprised, because while preparing materials for this video, we noticed one remarkable thing. Britain always makes the highest bid. It is often on the verge of total collapse, but eventually triumphs spectacularly, hitting the jackpot. Looking back at history, many things become clear, and Brexit seems to be a logical consequence of the country's convoluted history. But what does the future prepare for its former ruler of the seas? Is Britain able to find a new place in a world dominated by different forces relying on its heritage? Or will Brexit be the final chapter in the story of its former greatness? A resounding victory or the ultimate end of the empire? Let's get to the bottom of it. In order to try to predict the future, we have to go back in time. Now let's go a little further back and some more. Right here. While the European continent was in the midst of one tumultuous event after another, England remained modestly behind the scenes. In the age of antiquity, the Roman legions turned Britain into their distant province, and this continued until the 5th century when they left the island. But Britain didn't immediately become great. Instead, it plunged into the dark ages of internecine warfare, occasionally interrupted by Viking raids. Time passed, the rulers changed, the 100 Years' War passed, and finally something happened that made it clear. Britain was just waiting for its moment of glory. The Tudor dynasty came to power. What do you think is needed to turn an isolated island into the most important and powerful nation in the world? Perhaps oil or gold? Or an alien invasion, which is often associated with the mysterious greatness of ancient Egypt? No, not this time. By the way, we will talk about Egypt too. A video on this country is already in production. What do you think it will be about? Share your ideas in the comments below. We will include the most interesting ones in the video. But now let's get back to Great Britain. The correct answer is not gold, oil, or supernatural forces. All it took was a father's guidance, a few women, and the beginning of the age of exploration. Let's take it from the top. King Henry VII of England, being on his deathbed, asked his son what he would do when he became king.
What is the most important thing to do when you are king?
Make glorious war, father. Recapture the spirit of Agincourt. Expand the territories in France. Keep the Scots at bay.
The answer didn't impress the monarch. Henry frowned and told his son the words he would never forget.
To be a really great king, there is one thing you must do above all others. You must secure the family line. Have a son.
The king demanded that his son ensure the continuation of the dynasty. As you can guess, the son of Henry VII was Henry VIII. Yes, the one who had 6 wives, 2 of whom were the notorious Boleyn sisters. So, young Henry got the instructions from his father and hurried to fulfill them by marrying the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. But after 12 years, the joy of married life vanished. During this time, 5 babies died, and only 1 morbidly survived. But that was a girl. I should mention that the king's mistresses were replaced one after another. They often gave birth to his babies. Sometimes they were boys, but Henry VIII dreamed of an official son. Mary Boleyn became one of his mistresses, and soon the king noticed her sister, Anne. The girl was more cunning than her predecessors and refused Henry's attempts to court her for several years, promising to give birth to a son only in an official marriage.
As long as we remain unmarried, any child I gave you would be doped bastard. And I hope.
By the way, a very interesting movie, The Other Boleyn Girl, was made about this. We recommend watching it for those who want to know more about the royal intrigues of the time. Henry was willing to do anything for the sake of Boleyn and demanded that the Pope dissolve his first marriage with Catherine of Aragon. Catholic Rome refused to do so, and then Henry VIII decided to break up. No, not with Anne, but with the Catholic faith for the whole of Britain. Thus Britain went all in for the first time. Henry appointed himself head of the Church of England and finally married Anne Boleyn. By the way, she never bore him a son, for which he would behead her a little later. But that's a different story. Britain's renunciation of Catholicism turned the course of history upside down. The country cut off all relations with the rest of Europe. Its neighbours were shocked, some were even ready to declare war. Who knows what could have happened to Britain in exile if it had not been for the beginning of the age of the great geographical discoveries. At that very moment, the sea on all sides became not a burden but salvation for England. Soon Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, would take the throne. Things were not going well for her. The treasury was empty and her Catholic neighbours insulted the young queen, never recognising Henry VIII's second marriage. The history of England seemed to be moving towards total collapse. But Elizabeth went all in once again in history and won. By the way, friends, right now you can make your bet. Subscribe to our channel and after watching this video to the end, share it with your friends. We promise to publish only the most interesting material, so your victory is guaranteed. The pivotal thing for Elizabeth was something that will probably surprise you. To put it in modern terms, it was a development of a personal brand. While other women were looking to forge a favourable alliance for the country, Elizabeth I declared herself the Virgin Queen. "I am married to England," she said, and her ratings among the English rose to unprecedented adoration. Dozens of European princes, including even Ivan the Terrible, were wooing Elizabeth. It could have been a very interesting union. The Queen negotiated for decades, creating the illusion of a possible marriage, but always retreated at the last moment. This way she managed to postpone wars and weaken the influence of other countries on England several times. Elizabeth's reign strengthened the country, making the British Navy the best in the Atlantic. All of this was like a preparation for the 18th century when it became clear to everyone that Britain had its own unique way. While other European countries were drowning in neighbouring wars, England focused all its efforts on seizing territories across the ocean, forgetting all the rules and taking risks once again. Back in 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, according to which the whole world was divided only between these two countries. As you can guess, Britain ignored the decision of its neighbours and occupied part of America. This included taking New Amsterdam from the Dutch and renaming it New York. The peak of the British Empire's power was its colonial part of history. The British promoted the idea of a great civilizing mission. According to this idea, India, Africa, Latin America, Burma, Hong Kong, and all the other countries, well, basically almost every place except Britain, was inhabited by savages, primitive and brutal people to whom they should come and teach them law, order, trade, and morality. So, in fact, the slave trade and the natural resources of its colonies brought immeasurable wealth to Britain. The story of Robert Clive, one of the cruelest and richest colonists, illustrates this very well. A little later, and the British would call him the Master of India, and the Indians would call him the White Demon. But it all started in a stuffy office where Clive worked as a clerk. His work bored him so much that he, falling into depression, decided to join the army of the East India Company. He only had to wait for a lucky chance to prove himself, and there it was. At the age of 26, he became a hero, holding a fortress for 50 days with only a handful of soldiers in the defense of South India. The career of young Clive went uphill, and soon he got a chance to repeat his heroic feat by defeating 50,000 Bengalis. By the way, Clive's army had 10 times fewer soldiers. Robert Clive became governor of a vast part of India. The profits he brought to Britain were enormous. But after a while, it turned out that Clive was putting no lesser sums in his own pocket. Thus, the office clerk who went into the army out of boredom became one of the richest people of the 18th century. At the same time, during his governorship of the Indian colonies, more than 10 million Bengalis died of starvation. The fall of the empire. If only the British Empire had known that the very colonies that gave it power and wealth would destroy it. The beginning of the end happened on the European continent. It was 1763. Britain defeated France in the 7 Years' War, but found itself deep in debt. That's when the empire thought of its colonies. A variety of new tax levies were introduced. For example, the Stamp Duty Act is especially notorious. According to this act, the colonies must pay a tax for any document. If you register a company, you have to pay taxes. If you make a transaction, you have to pay taxes. Of course, the inhabitants of the colonies, who were already sending huge sums of money overseas, were not happy about this decision. The protests began. That's when neighboring countries, France, Spain, and Holland, got involved. No one was happy with the idea of the strong and wayward neighbor nearby, and the countries saw the war for American independence as a chance to regain their former greatness. We all know the outcome. The United States ceased to be a colony. Britain managed to maintain its status as an empire even though it lost, but Europe no longer looked at Britain as an invincible force. The next disaster came from somewhere no one expected. At the end of the 18th century, the Great French Revolution was raging in France. At first, British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger called the events an internal French affair. But after the public execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the entire European monarchy shuddered. For they could be next. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Spain, all of them urgently united in an anti-French coalition. Europe plunged into protracted battles with France, almost all of it. But Britain was more of a sponsor of this war, for which it would earn a new wave of dislike from its neighbours in the future. Although Britain, along with its allies, won the war, the tipping point had already been reached. Wars, world and colonial, one after another, throughout the entire 19th and 20th centuries had drained the purse strings of the British Empire. The turning point was World War II, which Britain could only win thanks to other nations. The world became bipolar. The USA and the USSR became the dominant forces. Britain's economy was collapsing, and the colonies were the first to be affected. 1947 is considered the beginning of the collapse for the empire because that was the year when India gained its independence. People who had lived under the oppression of the British for many years finally managed to gain strength and fight back. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, known by his shorter and simpler name, Gandhi, played a special role in this process. He offered India a new philosophy of non-violence, which resonated with nations in the early 20th century that were tired of countless wars. It became clear that the world had changed, and there was no longer any place in it for the orders of the old British Empire. Ideas of equality and human rights began to spread. Colonialism, which had brought Britain global influence, was immoral for everyone, becoming the final blow to the fading empire. By the end of the 20th century, Britain had returned to what it had been stubbornly running away from. It no longer had the strength and economic resources to go its own way, and it seemed that the European Economic Union was the only salvation. For almost a decade, prime ministers and presidents debated whether Britain could become part of the Union. The French president, Charles de Gaulle, twice vetoed applications from Britain. There were several reasons, and one of them was the isolation of the British throughout world history. Britain's attempts to join the European Economic Union were long and complicated. Charles de Gaulle's position was a major obstacle, but after he left office, the door opened. Britain finally found common ground with its neighbours and became part of the European Economic Union in 1973. Things went quiet for a while until Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979 and put the question point blank. The Prime Minister felt it was extremely unfair that Britain's contributions far exceeded what it was getting back. The phrase, "I want my money back," became famous all over the world. Several years of tough negotiations with other European Union countries helped Thatcher to get what she wanted. She managed to conclude an agreement under which Great Britain received an annual refund of part of its contributions. This event pleased the British as much as it tensed France and Germany. So, Great Britain is a member of the European Union. Finally, the country which had been in isolation for so long could fully experience all the benefits of friendship with its neighbours. British politicians entered all European parliaments and could gradually influence the ways of development of the whole of Europe. Of course, it was not the former imperial grandeur, but still, it was some power. Thus, thanks to the British influence, the European Union actively expanded to the east, taking Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and the Baltic states under its wing. More countries, more opportunities for economic growth, as British politicians reasoned at the time, and they were right. The borders opened up and new agreements, trade and investment flowed in. Both the British and other countries of the Union enjoyed such benefits. They could now travel to any European country to study, start a business, start a family, or have a vacation. However, open borders, which were meant to bring friendship and prosperity between countries, have become one of the most sensitive political topics of the last decades. Let's rewind a bit. While European countries were signing agreements in luxurious offices on the other side of the planet, things were not so peaceful. Civil wars and conflicts in the Middle East countries such as Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and African countries such as Somalia, Sudan, and Eritrea forced millions of people to leave their homes. Basically, there were former colonies suddenly left without foreign leaders. People have started moving to Europe. Why? It is the obligation of every country in the liberal European Union to accept refugees and provide them with asylum and financial support. Perfect conditions for migrants who have lost their homes. So millions of people headed towards developed, beautiful Britain. Year after year, refugees flooded the great empire, bringing with them not only their families but also their culture, religion and customs. The private nature of the British, hardened by their isolated life, should have gradually changed and softened due to the fusion of different European cultures. However, it never happened. Despite economic growth, a large part of the British population was dissatisfied with the current situation. The prideful, historically accustomed to great conquests, the British found it difficult to submit to the common rules. Brussels, where the central power of the European Union is located and where the most important decisions are made, began to seem like a foreign power. The British, who opposed their neighbouring countries throughout history, could not accept the fact that someone else may interfere in their country, control it, and impose their own rules. Thus, the imperial past and the feeling of being superior to others prevented Britain from truly becoming part of Europe. For instance, in the 1990s, European countries strived to create a unified currency, and they finally succeeded. We all know it as the euro. When you visit Europe, you can pay for a glass of wine with the same money in all the countries of the Union. Almost all of them, because Great Britain rejected the euro and kept its native pound sterling. As time went on, the situation with mass migration only worsened. By 2016, Britain was accepting about 300,000 migrants annually. Refugees arrived officially, came by boat across the English Channel, or even hid in trucks. So what did Britain try to do? First, the government introduced a system of evaluation for each labour migrant. When someone arrived at the English borders in search of a better life, let's say from Bosaso, a small Somali port town, they were met with questions. What education do they have? What qualifications? Do they speak English? Is there any job for them? If a person failed the test, they were not allowed to enter the country and seek a better life here. Britain also tried to deal with the source of the problem, sending millions of pounds to help African countries. But as time showed, it was too late. Discontent increased and the headlines began to scream about the former empire losing control of its borders. And now we've arrived at the time familiar to all of us. Distinguished gentlemen, tea at 5 o'clock and Britain's former imperial grandeur vanished into oblivion. Open borders have brought millions of migrants into the country, with refugees flooding the streets of London and other major cities. Almost 40 years have passed since Margaret Thatcher's demands, but the problems remain the same. Britain invested huge sums in the European Union every year and received nothing but economic problems in return. For example, in 2015, Britain transferred about £13 billion to the European Union budget and received back only £4.5 billion. That is almost 3 times less. Unpleasant math, don't you think? In 2016, the referendum that started the process known to the world as Brexit happened, and the slogan was, "Let's take back control." 4 years later, in 2020, Britain officially ceased being a member of the European Union and regained its independence. The process was complicated. The other countries were reluctant to let rich Britain leave the Union, especially France and Germany. But it is understandable. Being an economic leader in Europe is not always an honorable title. After all, according to EU agreements, the strongest help the weaker. And after Britain leaves, the help to Romanians, Bulgarians and other poorer countries will fall on the shoulders of France and Germany. Unpleasant situation. However, some supported the former empire's decision. Among them were China and naturally the United States in the person of Donald Trump. And of course, they were not only driven by friendly interest. It will be very convenient to build trade agreements with Britain, which has sharply cut off ties with its neighbors. The process was difficult, and there were many opponents within Britain itself. Two sides clashed. The first didn't want to take risks. They wanted stability and the usual friendship with neighbors, even though that friendship was not profitable for Britain. The second side wanted to restore Britain's independence and former greatness, even if everything was at stake. Great Britain went all in once again in its history. It put everything at stake: relations with its neighbors, its economy, and dreams of a return to its imperial past. The heirs of the empire on which the sun never set and the ruler of the seas could not accept the secondary role for England. They considered themselves a special nation for countries, a great empire, so they could not fully integrate into collective Europe. They have always considered themselves above it. Brexit was just a confirmation that the British are not ready to give up their idea of their own exceptionalism even now. Brexit was the logical, albeit controversial, outcome of Britain's past. It was an attempt to regain control and independence in a world that no longer revolves around London. It's been 5 years since Britain left the European Union, and so far the results are disappointing. Let's take a look at the numbers. Obviously, trade with the European Union has plummeted. Over the first 3 years, Britain has lost £100 billion. Oh! More than 1 million European workers are leaving Britain and returning to their homelands. As a result, agriculture, construction, medicine and transportation are left without a workforce, and there is a severe staff shortage. Major financial companies leave England and withdraw about £800 billion from London. The sum is huge, the economy is shaking like an earthquake, prices are rising even for food, and the pound is falling by 20%. Remember when we talked about Britain's efforts to control its borders because migrants are coming, even hiding in trucks and boats? Well, meticulous border inspections also contribute to the huge list of costs and losses of an independent Britain. But the most serious problem, arguably, was the internal division of the country. Against the backdrop of all the changes, Scotland and Northern Ireland decided that they wanted to be independent and started to declare it actively. In any case, we cannot draw any firm conclusions based on the first 5 years of independence. It is hard to predict what will happen to Britain's ambitions next. The influence of the British Empire is in the past, but the whole world still watches weddings and funerals of members of the royalty family, teaches their children English, and reads Shakespeare and Conan Doyle the 100th time. Besides, we should not forget that Great Britain still possesses nuclear weapons and can influence the actions of other nations in this way. Also, the United States, China and India, who don't mind building trade relations, are also an option to get the British economy back on track. This means there is still a chance that their bet will be successful. Perhaps, instead of trying to regain its former greatness, England should focus on creating a new, more resilient future. After all, as history demonstrates, real power is not about control over others, but about the ability to evolve as times change. Our prediction is that Britain will go through a long and challenging period of adaptation. Imperial greatness will not return, but the country will be able to maintain its influence through its strong culture, language, science, and new trade alliances. What do you think the future holds for Great Britain? Please share your opinion in the comments section. We'll read it and answer it. Thank you for watching this video. Like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel if you like to dive into the secrets of the success of different countries, predict the world's future based on facts, and analyze the most interesting events in the history of mankind. All of this is coming on our channel. Don't miss it. See you soon, dear viewers. The story goes on.